In the last PowerPoint, we talked about some general things you should consider as you are developing a plot. In this PowerPoint, we'll actually be talking about the specific information that you should have in each part of your IEP plot. IEPs look very different from school district to school district. As most of you already know, the state of Virginia has recently adopted a statewide IEP program, which will be piloted this fall by several school districts. But regardless of how the information is organized in an IEP plot, all of the following should be included. Considerations, which we'll talk about a little bit later, strengths, needs, effect of the disability, academic performance, and functional performance. This list must be considered at each IEP meeting. The list is usually organized in the IEP just like this, as a list. However, the information may be included or embedded within the plot or other parts of the IEP. Most programs have this information as a list simply to ensure that the IEP team does not neglect to consider each of these things and to help those who are looking for that information to locate it easily. The results of the most recent evaluations should include the last of eligibility evaluations, a summary of that information, a brief summary, and also the conclusions of any review of existing data or assessment reviews that have been done since that last eligibility meeting. A brief description of the academic and functional skills as well as the student strengths and needs. The parent concerns. It's very, very important that before an IEP meeting, you actually send a letter or a form to the parents to get their input about any concerns that they may have. If you're not able to get this prior to the meeting, it's very important that you collect that information at the meeting. You also must consider whether there is a need for benchmarks or short-term objectives. If there's not, you simply state the team considered this and has determined that it's not necessary for the student. Behavioral concerns. The state requires that we consider behavioral concerns, specifically whether those concerns interfere or impede the learning of that student or others. If you determine as an IEP team that the student does have behaviors that impact their learning or the learning of others, it is important that you address those behaviors adequately in the IEP. The student's communication skills need to be considered, whether the student has language skills related to English as a second language. Hearing impairment and vision impairment must be considered as well, but be careful, this only pertains to students who have been found eligible as having a hearing impairment or a vision impairment through the eligibility process. This should not include students who may just wear glasses, maybe their glasses need to be updated, or they have a mild hearing loss. This only pertains to students who have been found eligible through the eligibility process. Lastly, we must consider extended school year services. I caution you to, if you state on your IEP that you will look at extended school year services in the spring, then this means no matter what, you have to reconvene and consider them. So most of the time, it's most helpful just to say that they're not warranted and at this time, and then if you later decide to reconsider them, you can do that at that time. But unless you're absolutely positive that they may need them or that you think that they may need them, it's best to go ahead and say, at least at this time, we have not determined a need for them. That leaves the door open for considering it later. I'm most familiar with IEP Online, and in that program, it is organized in a way that all the considerations are first, and then you go into the different parts of the IEP PLOP summary. If your IEP program is not organized in some kind of structure, I recommend that you make your own outline or structure just to help you and ensuring that you have included all the necessary information. In IEP Online, that structure begins with strengths, and these strengths should, first of all, be related to school. Try to avoid things that aren't relevant. Also, be sure that you do include strengths. I've actually had teachers tell me, well, this student doesn't have any strengths. All students have strengths. It doesn't have to be their strengths as compared to other students in their same age group, but strengths compared to themselves. For example, a student's strength may be in written language, even if their written language is slightly below grade level, if it's higher than their other skills. So think of that student's personal strengths. And things like getting along with others may be important to school if you mention specific examples. For example, that the student works well in groups and teams to complete projects, or they get along well with their peers in the classroom, in the lunchroom, and on the playground. Make sure that your strengths are specific. Try to say if a student has a strength in writing, are they creative? Do they have nice handwriting? Do they have good grammar skills? Do they have good organization? State specifically what the strengths are and then give examples. In writing class, the student has great ideas and comes up with very unique ideas, or the student is always able to stay on topic and begin and end their essays in a very organized manner. Try to be specific with strengths so that the person who reads that IEP will get an idea of where that student actually excels. The needs section of the IEP is very important because it is from this section that you will be developing your goals. The needs are simply what areas of weaknesses does the student have. Be specific and be sure that you state them professionally and in a positive way. We've already talked about this. It's also important that you prioritize those needs and you look at what the student needs next. Resist the temptation to list every single thing the student would need, because it gets overwhelming and you could use up to 30 or 40 goals. So if you have a student, let's say, who is in second grade and really doesn't even know their letters, instead of writing everything they might need to know to get to second grade level, it's important to focus on what they actually need now to progress and to move forward. For example, you may state that they need to learn all of their letters, they need to learn all of their letter sounds, and they need to learn this many basic sight words. Also, consider parent input. What does the parent see as the student's most important needs? Lastly, you need to include what their needs are in relationship to their standards of learning. What areas do they really need to remediate to improve their success in the standards of learning? What areas are crucial for them? When looking at the effects of the disability, it is important to include how the disability impacts the student academically, socially, and functionally at school. For example, if a student has autism and they have a communication deficit, it's important to explain how this communication deficit impacts their ability to follow teacher directions, or their ability to respond to questions, or to complete assignments, as well as how it may affect their ability to build relationships in the school environment, or to function in novel situations. Remember, be specific, give examples, and talk about how it affects a student in a way that will help the person reading that IEP to support the student. This is also a section where I like to put what accommodations the student may require due to their disability. For example, if a student has a reading disability, this may impact their ability to complete word problems in math. Therefore, they may need a read aloud accommodation in math for that reason. Remember, be specific and talk about how that student could benefit from accommodations. In the next two sections, we'll be talking about the student's actual performance. This is a description of how the student is functioning right now. It should have some test scores in it, if that's necessary, or it should describe very specific data so that the person reading the IEP gets a good picture of the student's current performance. If you are including test scores in an IEP, you must describe the test, what it measures, and what the scores mean. It is never appropriate to assume that all people who are reading your IEP understand what the test scores mean. For example, you should not list SOL scores without explaining what the cutoff for passing an SOL score is. This is also the area where you should talk about the progress the student has made academically since the last IEP. It's very important to include the progress that the student has made within the last year. This is your documentation and evidence that the student is appropriately placed and that they are receiving the appropriate services. The evidence is the student is making progress or the expected progress on their goals. This section should also provide some baselines for those academic goals. Functional performance has to be included in all IEPs. And basically, it's just all those skills that impact a student's functioning in the school environment that are outside of the actual academic skills. For example, these may include the student's communication skills, their self-advocacy skills, their organizational skills, their study skills, pre-employment skills, and in the case of your students who may have more significant disabilities, you would actually look at their adaptive skills, their independent living skills, their sensory issues, basically anything that may be impacting that student's functioning in the school setting. It's also a very good place to mention the student's transition. How is that student doing towards their transition goals, or what things has that student identified as interest or possible long-term goals? It's important to start thinking about transition with that first IEP. And of course, if a student is very, very young, it may be very general statements such as the student seems to enjoy working with their hands, or the student seems to work well in a team, the student seems to be interested in working with people, which that will be more specific as the student matures and the student expresses more about their interest. You might begin to include statements like the student reports that they prefer to work outside, or the student prefers a career in retail, or the student would like to pursue a career in the military. We also get the professional football player and the actor and the actresses. That's all fine because we all have dreams and aspirations that should not be discouraged. However, as that student matures, our job is to help that student to begin to narrow that down to a real obtainable goal so that they can make that their target. We've talked a lot about one small part of the IEP, and I hope it's not too overwhelming. As you go back through this information, I want you to remember that while we want to be thorough, while we want to be updated, while we want to be relevant, and we want the IEP PLOP to be practical, we also want it to be concise. Avoid the temptation of thinking the more I write, the better the PLOP is. It's not the amount of writing you do in the PLOP. We've talked a lot about one section of the IEP, and it can be overwhelming. But as you go back and you look at each piece that we've talked about, I want you to remember that it's important to resist the temptation to think that the more I write into the IEP plop, the better. It's not necessarily the quantity of information, but the quality of information that you're looking for here. Make sure that you have written information in a way that it's easy for someone to follow and it's easy for them to pick out and organize the important information. Remember, this is a tool that's going to be used. I like to think of the IEP as an instructional manual for a student's education plan. We all have had those instructional manuals that are like 600 pages long and we don't even want to begin to open them. And then you have those that just give you the information you need step by step. That's what we want in our IEP plop. We want good, solid, thorough, updated information organized in such a way that it's easy and efficient for us to access.